Okay, welcome to a live stream. We're doing another one of our Q&A support streams, which means we're just going to be talking about various topics that you as the viewer are interested in. And if you're not interested in anything, that makes it super easy. We'll just keep it a super short stream. I think we're going to at least attempt to be focused around MIDI tonight, but of course, with any of these things, we can go off in any direction that you want. MIDI is one of my favorite things about music production, not because it replaces musicians, but because of the cool things you can do with it. I was just loading up a cool synth patch here with a retro synth, an arpeggiator, and a note repeater, which you can do really cool things with. Right? So that's just super simple tools. All of that made possible by the ability to manipulate our MIDI in different ways. The arpeggiator, followed by a note repeater. I love it. We can even make it more complex by adding more of the repeats. But it's the data. It's the data and the controlling of the data that I like the most. Let's have that ramp down even further. Let's see. Too much for that, but maybe if we did it faster or a shorter duration. Probably would never do it quite that much, but that flexibility of controlling the data after you trigger it with some sort of MIDI controller. I think that's the real part that becomes interesting, right? The part that allows us to create things that we couldn't create without it. Now, there's certain things we can always create musically. The drummer track is a perfect example. Is it better to have a real drummer who's really great at the drums come into a studio and record them playing? I think so. I think that's better than having the drummer track, which has a very limited palette, right? So that's a case of maybe I don't have a drummer, so I'm going to use the drummer track in lieu of it for either a period of time or for the whole time, because maybe it's a song I'm working on that I don't want to have to worry about. Maybe it's not going to be released for money, and so why would I spend money hiring a drummer? There's things to think about with that. And then other instruments like doing a string section. You could have real string players play the part or use a sample library. Which one's better? The strings with the real performers are probably going to be better. It takes a lot more time, effort, preparation, so many different factors. And so maybe a real string section isn't the right thing for everybody. That's not exactly what I'm thinking, though, when I think about MIDI being a really powerful tool. I'm thinking more like the arpeggiator, having it do a rate of like 30-second notes, right? Something that outside of, there's no musician that can play exactly what that is. And so we're not replacing a musician. We're creating something that even could not be created in any other way. for me, I think that that's part of the cool part of MIDI. It can do both. It can recreate something that's real, something that a performer could play. Maybe it's pre-production and you're just doing a demo for a musician. But also it could be that you want something that's completely non-realistic in terms of an acoustic instrument or even an electric instrument, and you want to have something new. Well, I think that that's the beauty of MIDI. You can do all of those things with it. Right? So that part of MIDI is my favorite part. Okay, hopefully we got some people showing up. If you have a topic you'd like to discuss, just put it in the chat and we will meander our way onto those. If not, I'll tell you one of my favorite things about retro synth. And a key element to using this feature correctly. So if we don't have any comments coming in, then just hang tight because I'm going to tell you a little bit about retro synth for a second. Let me create a new track and put a retro synth. That's the default because I do think this is interesting. Right, that's the default patch of RetroSynth. RetroSynth, in my opinion, is one of the more powerful synthesizers in Logic in terms of ease of use and from loading it to using it the shortest amount of time because there's fewer things to change. But under the settings, let's expand them down here. Let's see. Oh, they're up, actually up, not down. Right here, you'll see the default patch has a unison setting of 2. Now, if you don't know what unison is, it just it means it's going to take the available voices, and any one note you play, it's going to do 2 of those. It's going to essentially duplicate it. So you could do a 4 voice or an 8 voice. Now that the change of the pitch right there, how it's sweeping, is a function of the number of voices and the voice detune. So if I pull the voice detune down to 0, now it sounds a lot louder because their phase aligned and they're going to boost. The minute we detune, it's actually going to create this phase relationship between each of the voices. So if you want to do more detune and keep the sound more pure, we turn off the unison, which is on by default to 2. But now we can actually bring the voice detune up. And we have a little bit more analog sound without all the phase stuff. It's kind of cool. And Q Coletti says Disclosure uses RetroSynth all the time. I think it's a great instrument. I think it's actually really great. But you have to understand the parts of it, like this. With the global settings, the unison, if you are like, ooh, I heard voice detune makes it sound more analog, but you leave it up on that 2. Then you end up with something that sounds a little less maybe what you're hoping for. Man, I don't know if you're hearing that in the different left and right. Stereo spread in action. Right, so let's voice detune just a little bit. So it's 0.4 is a little bit much for my taste, but in the 30s, a little bit more. So turning off the unison sometimes makes a lot of sense. And then turning on the 8-voice unison can really sound strange with the voice detune, so I'm almost always turning that off. And let's just... get some really cool sounds. So Yuri says, I'd like to hear you talk about mixing MIDI tracks with real recordings. I've read something regarding some difficulties on picking the ideal sample rate for a session such as this. What's your take? Sample rate. Sample rate rarely plays into anything I'm thinking about when I'm doing MIDI with real instruments. I think it's more about the programming than anything. So I've definitely done, for instance, some orchestral MIDI tracks. And when I did the orchestral things, I would pick one instrument or two instruments and record like a real musician. One of them I did a number of years ago is like kind of like a clone of Indiana Jones. And there was a brass section, and we brought in like a single trumpet to give us like the realistic part of the main theme. And so I think really getting the MIDI bed track as close as possible first was key. So then once we bring in the trumpet and record it, we're not changing tempo, we're not changing key, we're not changing anything. It can then fit into the final thing. On top or other than that, I would say the quality of the instruments you're using in the virtual realm make a big difference. So let me give you a couple examples. One of them would be the studio strings from Logic, which I got to tell you, you should only use in an emergency, right? Right? I mean, sure, they sound like strings, right? But I don't even have right on this computer the Composer Cloud from East West, but I have the Hollywood strings and a few other things. Let's do like a full string, long. I think I'll do one of those ones right there. Okay. Let's do this with the actual joystick. Right, so those strings sound a little different than these strings. I mean, it says string ensemble, and the other one says string orchestra. Same name, kind of, but very different instruments. There's no way to make the studio strings in Logic sound like that. So we're at a huge disadvantage in terms of mixing those sounds with other instruments right off the bat because they just don't sound good. And then on top of that, I would say We have our own mix engine in this particular tool. Let's go. I think I unloaded it. And this has like a whole solid state logic channel strip in there. So, I mean, we're like looking at some really great tools. Okay, so Yuri's going to explain a little bit more here. I think it had something to do with artifacts that appear when you use VSTs on 44.1 or 48. So people would double it for the MIDI part. I mean, again, I understand why people would say 44.1 or 48 or 96 or 88 or 192. None of that matters. Not really. Sure, you might be able to go through with an auditory microscope and hear some artifacts that may distract a little bit. But I promise, if you're using the right tools in the right way, that's not going to matter. You have to really there's just so many steps before I would worry about sample rate. And you could use everything at 44.1. And if you were performing it and sequencing it and then using the right processing tools, the right reverb, and you were getting all the levels correct and mixing in like a real instrument with the virtual ones, that it's not going to matter. It's like, I know there was this thing. There's an engineer who a number of years ago now, when things were just getting into higher quality, like 96 kilohertz sample rates. This was like at the baby steps of that they worked on some very high quality, immersive mixes from some really big name musicians. And they were recording everything at like 96, right? 96K. And this one step in the chain was this engineer who had like an old Pro Tools rig that only did 44.1 or 48. And so they would get these files that sounded amazing. He would kind of secretly down sample everything so he could do it on his system, do the mix, export it. Somebody would convert it back to the higher rate for him. And these things would win like Grammys. I mean, I don't think that's the limiting factor in this. I don't think it is. I don't think the lower sample rates make as much of a difference. It does to some people. There are engineers who swear that 48K sounds horrible to them, and this probably does. I'm not denying. I'm just saying that the real steps to sell the realism of a recording and a performance and a sequence are going to be other things than the sample rate. That's all. I mean, in my own experience, I think it's rare. So that's the other thing. I have students at the university who are like, I need this reverb that sounds amazing. It's going to fix all my problems. And I'm like, I promise you, getting a better reverb is never going to fix any of your projects. A reverb is the least concerning thing of any project, really. Because it amplifies what you put into it, right? I mean, it changes. It's based on what you put into it. You could really pick the wrong algorithm or the wrong impulse. But most of the time, if your music doesn't sound good from the minute you record it or sequence it, it's never going to sound professional, right? You can't polish a turd. All you do is get poop all over your hands. I mean, it's like you got to have the ear for excellence starting at the very beginning. That's really the most important thing. So, yes, it's super great that Logic has studio strings. Would I ever use them on anything? maybe as a really rough demo, as if I'm just like trying to sort through some chords or something. But otherwise, it's pretty rare that I'm going to use those in any way that people can actually hear them. Now, other instruments, because those aren't the only things that we use that are fake, right? Even the studio horns, I think, are a little bit better. Right? Some of those, like the trumpet, sounds decent. I don't know if I would still replace it in terms of instead of a real player if I could. The saxophones are always hard. I mean, it doesn't even play 3 notes and you're like, ooh, that's a sampled instrument. But then there's all these other ones that we have, right? Organ, or like bass guitar. It's like, what do we use for bass guitar, right? Let's see, bass. I really do like the Liverpool bass. That's a sampled instrument. Has that little fall if you hit the key hard enough. I mean, there's some cool things. We have the upright bass. I mean, you can replace a bass player with that because it sits in the bottom and is not really the featured instrument. Pianos, oof, that's a really touchy subject with Logic. Let's do a Steinway for a second. And let's do a comparison with, again, maybe one of my favorite sampled instruments, at least one that I know well and continue to use, which is hidden inside the East West Symphonic Orchestra percussion, Steinway B. And let's do a replace all. And let's play the Logic one first. Right? I mean, it sounds like a piano, sure. And you can program that with MIDI, but I need to practice with the metronome. All right, so that's the non-Logic. Here's the Logic one again. I mean, that's like recorded close with no good stereo imaging, a crappy sounding room. I mean, where did they get that piano and why do they keep including it? It sounds horrible when you compare it. Where did my mouse go? There it is. Sounds way better. It does matter, even in the MIDI world, what instrument you start with. You could say, you know what, I'm just going to play the Logic piano, and then we'll change it later. You know, it's like we'll upgrade it later. This is just a starting point for like writing the song. Problem is, you build a song with your spectrum all over the place. Instead of having this nice wide image that sounds pretty with what we consider an industry standard stereo mic technique, you have this weird imaging and you have a lot of like low mids that are built up. You have that, and then you start putting that with other instruments, like a bass and a guitar and a vocal. And all of a sudden, all of those other pieces, you start like putting them together. And then later, if you change the piano, you've pretty much got to backtrack with everything else to make it then work with the new thing. So sure, you can change out things later, but does it really help you? It actually pushes you backwards in terms of the overall quality of the mix. So you want to start with as high of quality of tools as you can at the very beginning, even in the songwriting process. You want things to sound done as you're starting, right? That's how you know when you're working with good musicians. A few years ago, I did the tracking on a bluegrass fusion album with a drummer and a bass player who were amazing. And I just remember we set up and they started playing the tunes. It's like the drummer made one mistake the whole day that they had to do a retrack of. And it was because the chart was wrong, not because they actually had made a mistake. It was they played the mistake perfectly. And it's like one time through the song to rehearse, one time to track. And that was what ended up on the final album, right? I mean, it was like, okay, I'm good at this recording thing when I work with really great musicians. That's why choosing your tools at the beginning is so important. And then Gunther says, I either start with a synth or a sample. I do a lot with synthesizers personally as well. Or lately, I have been doing a lot with some really basic Logic tools. For instance, I might do like 60 songwriter or roots brush. And then with this, I will use the vintage electric piano, which I think sounds decent. There's some lower mid stuff that's a little bit wonky every once in a while, and it distorts a little too easy for me. Not like the distortion of the real instrument, but like the distortion of it like a digital instrument. Ooh. But even then, say that I'm starting with like just basic instruments like that, I pull open effects and start doing all kinds of stuff right from the beginning. Because you get to a point where you're using the tools and you know what you like a guitar player who has their pedals and things dialed in. It's like you can do that with any instrument. If you use it enough, you're going to get to know what you want. Drums are a little soft still, but you get the idea. It's like you build it out, you make it sound good so that when you're playing it, it feels right. And then you go with it. Too much. But MIDI does some stuff here that I can't do, right? So I come in here and I'm like, let's do the groove track. Let's add the capture recording option so I can just play. Let's see. Oops, made marquee. Yeah, don't do that. Let's see. There we go. All right, so groove track. Let's make the drum, the groove source, and what I just played follow that. So that's like a groove quantize. I need to change that bass. But it's like we can just add this and then it handles my weaknesses, which are playing in time. I mean, great. I could practice a bunch more and get it more in time. But I think of myself more as a person who programs the instruments for the sound, and I build out the rest of it around my weaknesses. And so I really like Logic and what it can do for me in that area. So let's do... Let's see with retro synth. And I'm actually going to put one of the velocity processors here so that it controls some of my notes a little bit better. Okay. Okay, let's do the capture recording, groove track that. Right? The only time I can actually get away with using the Logic pianos is when I do this right here, where I use the multi-effects step. I digress. I love this part of the compositional process where you're sculpting sounds to make them a certain way, I guess. It's like building that sound. Maybe it's something you're hearing, maybe it's something you're just reacting to as you do it, but that process, that's something that with MIDI we can do that we can't easily do any other way. Sure, we could bring a band into a room and say, hey, let's improvise until we get something, but it's going to be unwieldy at times. And so I feel like the MIDI part of this allows me to be able to have that control and let what I'm imagining come out. And so I think that's important. That's an important part for me. Well, we did answer a little bit of question from Yuri earlier. If Q Coletti is still here, I did want to echo something they said earlier, which is the ES2 is an amazing instrument. Still, it does stuff that we don't really have as easily in some other places. Let me load the record arm there. This is a great instrument. I really like that we can change the filter to be between parallel and series. I like the triangle to mix the three sound sources. I really still like this, the matrix mode, which we've lost in some other places, like the sampler. I mean, we still have the ability to do all the modulation, but it's like you get used to this format, right? You get used to these boxes. And so you know exactly how they work. So then we have to change it. I don't even mind the UI. Everyone talks about the user interface. The only time I talk about user interface really is with like the Logic Pro for iPad, which for all the instruments, for me, took a major step backwards in terms of the user interface because it's harder to use them when it should be easier. Right? Maybe that's just me getting used to it. No, but this instrument does something nobody else. Okay, not nobody. Very few other synths are really doing, which is some of the vector options, right? Let me find a good vector. There we go. There was a vector. Nope. Where did I pass it? Let's find a good vector example. I haven't used any of the vector presets in a long time, but I still do the vector stuff sometimes. And maybe it's under gated. Let's see, where's a good example? Okay, so I don't even know if I like that one. Ooh, that was loud. Sorry. All of that's loud. Give me a break. And it just cranks it right back up. So let me change the volume over here. Man, the movement stuff this thing does is so good. So the vector stuff refers to a number of settings which you can put on timer, and then you set up the way that they unfold. So it'll, at each of these points, it'll play different groups of settings. You can see when I click on that, the little mixing triangle changes a little bit. And so does the, over here, the XY pad, which are set down here, XY, X, the X target, the Y target. And so you can change those settings over time, snapping them back and forth. You can come up with some really cool rhythmic things. And so I feel like this has a whole, like with every instrument in Logic. I mean, we're talking like Alchemy, right? RetroSynth, the ES2, Sculpture, mind blown, right? We're talking Ultra Beat. All of these things are like whole universes of sounds, and you can use probably any one of them to create endless variations of whatever you'd want. And the sound design capabilities, the instrument capabilities, how many of you are just using presets or doing some basic tweaks? How many of you are actually going through and creating sounds from scratch with these instruments? My guess is that it's very few that are doing that from scratch, and so are really not taking advantage of some of the most powerful parts of this. But that's like a whole, like a career worth of learning for each of these instruments. And so you don't find this with that many other tools. I would argue that Ableton has some real depth when it comes to some of the instruments. Each digital audio workstation has a couple, right? It's like Pro Tools has that one vacuum synth that comes with it, and a drum machine. And Studio One has a lot of instruments, but only a few really deep ones. FL Studio, if you get like the upper versions of it, sure, you're going to get a bunch of things, but not as many as this, I don't feel like. Reaper, sure, you can get a bunch of third-party things, but it doesn't come with a ton of things by itself. Just by itself, what comes with the software, very few workstations come with the depth of instruments that are in Logic. I think that's a fact. Sure, you can get third-party things. Cool. And every time you update, maybe they'll work, maybe they won't, maybe the third-party things will close. It's hard to say. It's a good place on that rant to end. It's about 10:30 p.m. here in Denver. And so I think we're going to pull the plug. I know we had less questions and more ranting, but ranting's okay. I think it's helpful to hear somebody else rant about your favorite software and make you feel like you made the right life choices. But I can't help you with that. So good luck. I'm just kidding. Gunther says, I do not use Logic Synth much. I use Alchemy mostly for the sampling, especially the additive sampling. I love the drum machine designer Ultrabeat for adding percussion stuff. Yeah, I did a whole series of streams like a year or so ago about Alchemy, going through every feature of that beast. It's a beast and it's amazing, but it doesn't do everything. And so I think keeping the other tools in mind sometimes. Cool. That's where we're going to end. Thanks for joining. And come again soon. We're going to do more of these streams always. But I'll talk to you later.